The notion of good strategy really has to be redefined and continually revisited for the reality that healthcare brands are operating in now. It cannot be a static discipline, a static exercise, a siloed one. It needs to be alive. It needs to be adaptive and dynamic and fluid enough to respond as the market changes or anticipate what may change and get out ahead of it.
A brand can keep optimizing the plan, our messaging strategy, our channel mix, the investment models, but the underlying conditions that made those choices are shifting, right? So Scenario Lab really helps teams catch those shifts earlier and keeps the question active. Are we still planning for the market that we're actually in, or the one that we built it around or that we're built for?
Welcome back to the MM+M podcast. I'm Lesha Bushak, pharma editor at MM+M, and I'm excited to bring you today's podcast with Syneos Health Communications. And we're going to talk about how marketers can switch from a more traditional planning model to an adaptive, senior-based approach to strategy. Here with me today is Carolyn Stephenson, EVP Central Strategy at Syneos Health Communications, and Carrie Mazza, VP of Brand Strategy, GSW, powered by Syneos Health Communications. Carolyn and Carrie, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
So we know there's been a lot of change in the healthcare marketing industry in the last few years. Obviously, the rapid AI adoption that's been happening, evolving patient expectations. So in the big picture, what is fundamentally wrong or broken about the way that healthcare brands plan? And why do we need to kind of pay attention to changing this?
Yeah, great question. Really, the broken part is not scenario planning itself. This kind of scenario-based thinking and planning has always been around in analog forms well before the advent of technology and AI and, this age of accelerations that we're living in. And smart strategists have really always asked questions like, well, what could happen? What might change? What do we have to do if the market moves in a different direction? The thing that is broken is that the way that we do it just has not kept pace with the world that we're now operating in. And we see this all the time with healthcare brands and our clients. They're planning in an environment where the context around them is constantly shifting. Things like stakeholder expectations and access dynamics and, competitive pressure, cultural conversations. And, of course, as you mentioned, the advent and acceleration around AI. Everyone's asking how AI could show up in the work, but really we see the main opportunity is not to use AI to replace human expertise. It's to strategically use it to amplify and extend that expertise, to cast a wider net and help us see more possibilities, to kind of pressure test more assumptions, to prepare for more possible versions of the future than we could on our own. And I think that, Carrie will talk a little bit about this with some of our specific clients, but healthcare has a really specific planning challenge in and of itself. We operate inside of very real constraints, whether we're talking regulatory or clinical, organizational constraints, of course. And too often those constraints can make brands more conservative. They kind of narrow the aperture. And so that leads to really safe, very linear, very didactic planning. But we really believe that the constraints should not be the enemy of creativity. And so, we're actually the conditions within which creativity has to work. So, that's where something like this kind of scenario planning we're talking about today really comes in and can really thrive and really shine and modernize kind of this classic strategic discipline for the pace and the complexity of today's healthcare environment.
Hear a lot about scenario-based thinking, but what does it actually mean in practice for a healthcare marketer beyond what they're used to being sort of a typical planning exercise?
Yeah, great question. We like to think of scenario-based thinking as kind of this ongoing mindset rather than a mindset that we adopt, generally around key planning milestones, whether annually or biannually. And when we adopt this going forward, when we take on this ongoing mindset, that really helps healthcare marketers kind of break out of the typical scenarios that we traditionally plan for, right? So historically, we've planned around things that we like to call maybe known signals, things that we can see coming, right? The clinical and competitive events that are really time bound and easy to map into a planning cycle, right? They're going to fall on a calendar. we know when they're going to hit. These are your typical phase 3 readouts, guideline releases, key Congress moments, regulatory milestones, even competitor launches and activity, right, that we can see coming. And the critical thing is those moments still matter, but modern healthcare scenario planning really, as Carolyn said earlier, we like this phrase of widen the aperture. It's asking us to do that because what's really key here is the future doesn't always arrive on a timeline that we can neatly plan around, right? So Carolyn mentioned earlier, kind of we're shaped by this context that is constantly evolving around us, whether that's politics or culture or the economy and technology, quite obviously. But more importantly, the way people think, feel, and make decisions, right? That is always changing. So we need to plan for all of these plausible conditions, right? Not only these known scenarios, but some disruptive scenarios that could happen, right? That could really bring real risk to the brand and pressure test how we show up. We like to sometimes think of these as wild cards, right? Like, what if we had a GLP-1 level boom in cardiology? Or what if TikTok really drove the latest surge in testing, right? A celebrity diagnosis spike that really starts to call attention to a specific condition or therapeutic area, right? So that's the value of making scenario-based thinking an ongoing mindset, right? It helps us to embody this mindset that we are open to keeping that aperture wide and looking at those disruption scenarios in addition to those time-bound events, right? And what does that do for us, right? When we practice that mindset, it gives teams a shared way to stay curious, to challenge assumptions, to make sense of the change that's happening in real time, not just after it's already disrupted the plan. So the impact of that is real, whether it's with internal teams or with client teams in partnership together. We're all able to better spot what's shifting and kind of pressure test what that could mean and move with more confidence when that market starts to change versus reactively.
Carrie, I think that especially matters a lot right now because so many healthcare marketers, including 3 of our clients within the last week, are under a real efficiency mandate. How do you level up your strategic output while bringing the organization greater efficiencies and cost reductions and things like that? These teams are being asked to, move at the speed of culture and spend smarter and increase their productivity. And those questions are increasingly coming through the lens of how is AI helping us to do that? And that is the tension. How do you deliver that without sacrificing strategic depth? And so I think that this kind of scenario-based thinking, the scenario lab that we've developed really helps to solve for that. It allows the teams to cover more ground, explore more possibilities, do it faster, do it in an efficient way. So it's leveling up the strategic work. It's not flattening it, which I think is really critical.
And one of your tools, Scenario Lab, which is an AI-powered tool, actually aims to help address a lot of this. So can you talk us through how that works and what does Scenario Lab do to help clients, approach this differently?
Yes. So at its core, the Scenario Lab is, from a technical standpoint, it's an AI-powered scenario planning platform, right? And it helps teams really identify those plausible future scenarios or conditions that could meaningfully change our decisions and explore how people and systems and markets might respond. But what really makes it different is that it's built on behavioral principles, right? So it focuses on the behavioral futures that those events create, right? So how might decision-making change? How might adoption patterns shift? Or even how might priorities evolve across different stakeholders, right? Where are there red threads and where are there specific nuances? And while events create uncertainty, it's the change in behavior that ultimately determines how markets are going to develop and respond. And that's important because strategy doesn't ultimately succeed or fail based on events. We always like to say every brand challenge is really truly a behavior-based challenge, right? It succeeds or fails based on behavior change, the underlying change that we're trying to drive. And so the goal of Scenario Lab is really to create a clearer decision framework for uncertainty, right? It helps us define what is likely to remain true? What assumptions should we start testing? One of my favorite parts of the scenario lab is which clues should we be watching out for that this scenario could potentially be unfolding in front of us, right? And last, kind of how decisions may need to evolve as conditions change, right? What decision trade-offs do we need to be thinking about as these conditions start to unfold? So really from there, the lab becomes, as Carolyn mentioned, it's an ongoing decision support tool, right? It's not meant to replace us. It's that support tool that we can run concurrently with our human thinking and traditional kind of scenario planning. And it's built to be returned to be adapted and refreshed with new information as it emerges, because that context is constantly changing. We can evaluate signals and kind of continuously refine our understanding of the landscape alongside that tool. And finally, in that sense, it's really less about producing a single output and more about building a repeatable capability, right, for scenario-based thinking and that mindset that we talked about.
Yeah, so think of it as a supercharged AI environment, but of course AI is only as good as the inputs that fuel it. And so the way that we approach it is using behavior-based data sets. You know, pharma's two only intelligence platforms for healthcare decision making. We have one for HCPs and one for patients, and those become the foundational inputs for a scenario lab. And then, of course, layering on other data sources as appropriate, all keeping human judgment and decisions at the center of it. And I do think that, and Carrie, I'm sure you would agree with this, it becomes really powerful when you see it in action across a lot of different kinds of healthcare changes. We've used it to help launch teams prepare for different competitor moves, help access teams anticipate payer pushback or fallout points in the full access continuum and journey. We've used it to help HCP teams kind of pressure test what would actually shift prescribing behavior and drive a lift in that way. So the potential is really amazing, but kind of the concept in and of itself is simple. It's flexible and it's fluid and it's powerful, and it's exactly the way that marketers should be working in today's modern world.
You all kind of touched upon how uncertainty is a big challenge in healthcare, whether that's regulatory, competitive, or on the tech side of things. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges right now that brand leaders need to be paying attention to? And are there any signals that they need to really be tuned into that you think they might be misreading or underestimating?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Lasha. The notion of uncertainty is just such a given in this world. It's kind of the reality that every healthcare marketer is operating in now. And I believe one of the traps that we fall into is just assuming that more data automatically creates more certainty for us. But really it doesn't. It can very quickly lead to analysis paralysis. In some cases, more data can create more confidence, but only if we are incorporating the right sets of data, asking the right questions of it, and really discerning noise from signal. And so what Scenario Lab does is kind of widen the aperture first, helps us look at a broader set of possible futures. What could shift in the market? What could change behavior? What could create friction? What could put the brand at risk even? And then we apply data against those key questions, those scenarios, those things we know we need to navigate. And so we're not just brainstorming possibilities in the abstract. We're looking at things like likelihood of them to unfold, potential impact to the brand, potential impact to the people who need these therapies, other strategic implications for the organization or for teams. And that's where it really becomes a de-risking tool for teams. It helps teams make smarter decisions under the constant pressure of uncertainty, not because we are able to predict the future perfectly, but because we're better able to envision the future and then immerse ourselves in it so that we can plan ahead of time. But of course, thinking through all of that and discerning noise from signal is, such a key part of this. Carrie, I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything here.
Yeah, I think it helps to have a practical example of it. I mean, we're doing this now with a large biopharma company that's preparing for a second to market launch in the CV category, right? Where science and diagnostics, access dynamics, the competitive landscape is really truly still evolving, right? So for this brand, that uncertainty is very real. It is for every brand, but very real in this case, right? We're making decisions today in a category where the first entrant could change the entire treatment landscape, right? It could completely change the way that stakeholders kind of their expectations, how they respond, and really reset the market values before our brand or this brand ever really launches. And so that's just exactly where Scenario Lab really fits and where it's really powerful. It helps every function translate uncertainty into a brand. And that's really, really key for a second to market brand, such as the one that we're working with, in terms of that kind of functional alignment and how critical that is, right? If the first entrant changes how providers and payers and patients as a whole in this category understand it, then the brand needs one shared view of the market that it may enter and a clear path for how each function is going to help support that brand from now to launch and even beyond.
Yeah. And I'll just add one final thing to come back to kind of the signal portion of your question, Lesha. Especially when you're thinking about a launch situation, the context and planning around that launch is not static. So the way that we think about and collect signals cannot be either. And so in totality, this kind of scenario planning cannot be a one-time exercise where you define the future once and then you lock in the plan. It needs to become this continuous discipline, watching for what's changing, reinterpreting the scenarios as new signals emerge. Things that you may think are noise now might be an important signal 6 months in the future, and then adjusting, kind of the brand's choices before the market sort of forces our hand in that regard. So that's why I think that signal collection piece needs to be alive, adaptive, ongoing.
And how would you say taking this approach can change the way that teams make decisions, especially when there's a lot of times when there isn't really a right answer and confidence might be low around that decision making?
We have seen this time and again with teams. Scenario Lab helps make the scary parts of planning feel a lot less scary. When they are facing uncertainty, even around kind of budget allocation at, say, brand planning season. I think the instinct is either to kind of avoid things or over control things. And so Scenario Lab gives a little bit more objective and kind of structured way to look directly at the unknowns, name them, kind of rank and prioritize them and work through what they could mean for the brand. And ultimately, I think that does a few important things. It makes uncertainty feel more manageable, more actionable. It helps different stakeholders adopt different lenses. So we're often getting commercial, clinical, behavioral, access, regulatory teams all in this environment together. And then, they're coming together around a shared view of what could happen next. And because then everyone is sort of working from the same set of possible futures and a shared understanding, alignment happens so much faster. And we see the conversation really shift from, well, what are we afraid of? What do we need to mitigate, to what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And that's really where the ultimate value is. It's quicker alignment, better co-creation, more thoughtful solutions, before, again, the market kind of forces a reaction or puts you in a more passive posture.
I'll just add a couple of things there. I think what it really helps teams do is also work through ambiguity. We might not have all of the answers yet, especially if you're further out from launch or if you're getting closer. We don't have the luxury all the time of having them kind of handed to us on a platter. And so it really builds that confidence to be able to work through some outstanding questions that we might still, have hypotheses for, but at least start to get aligned around a singular plan and work together towards that future.
We know that a lot of organizations might actually be hesitant to shift away from traditional planning. So what would you say to them about what the risk is of not evolving?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the risk is that you keep getting better at the wrong thing, right? So we think Blockbuster is an easy example, right? We all lived in and grew up with Blockbuster. The warning signs were everywhere, right? We saw Redbox emerge outside of the Blockbuster. That was the first signal. Netflix was changing kind of the economics of rental through subscriptions and no late fees. Streaming came on. Consumers were moving more towards choice and control and less friction. And Blockbuster was really still focused on winning that in-store retail, right? That footprint, that experience, while the market was moving toward access. And so that's really kind of the risk of traditional planning when it becomes too fixed, right? A brand can keep optimizing the plan, our messaging strategy, our channel mix, the investment models, but the underlying conditions that made those choices are shifting, right? So Scenario Lab really helps teams catch those shifts earlier and keeps the question active. Are we still planning for the market that we're actually in or the one that we built it around or that we're built for?
Well, and I think the uncomfortable question for healthcare brands is, what are we still optimizing for that the market is already moving beyond? And what is the danger and the risk of doing a once annual brand planning exercise and then walking away from it for 9 months only to return again, 9 months to a year later, and you're doing the same song and dance.
Yeah. And that's really the Blockbuster lesson, right? They weren't bad at execution. They were executing really against just an outdated definition of the market. And that's really the risk here, right? You keep refining the plan and improving kind of the strategy that you've already set. But if the underlying conditions have shifted, as I mentioned, you're just really getting better at the wrong thing.
Yeah, I really like that Blockbuster and Netflix analogy. I think that's like a really strong way to paint this in sort of clear terms for people. Looking ahead to the future, how do you see scenario-based planning kind of change what good strategy means for healthcare brands today?
Boy, do I have opinions on this. Okay, so the notion of good strategy, and I'm using air quotes for those who can't see, really has to be redefined and continually revisited for the reality that healthcare brands are operating in now. It cannot be a static discipline, a static exercise, a siloed one. It needs to be alive. It needs to be adaptive and dynamic and fluid enough to respond as the market changes or anticipate what may change and get out ahead of it. And that also really means that strategy cannot sit inside one function. The best modern brands in and out of healthcare are building strategy more as a shared operating system with shared accountabilities where everyone is contributing intelligence and making decisions and activating in a really coordinated way. In fact, that's why we've developed our operating model the way that we have. It's called Ready, Sync, Pulse. And it just really helps to bring together lots of different functions around getting ready to anticipate what's coming, syncing to kind of turn those insights into a really smart coordinated strategy, and then Pulse to kind of read the market, go optimize and learn along the way. And so to me, I think modern healthcare strategy is not just about having the right answer at the start. It's about building the capability to keep learning, to create these learning loops, embed them in the business, and force alignment along the way across many different functions.
Great. Are there any other kind of thoughts that you have about the future? Any trends in this space that you're really excited about, kind of grasping, or anything that you're really looking forward to seeing come to fruition in the next year or so?
I'm really looking forward to continuing to watch the evolution of AI. I mean, I think we reached a really fast and high kind of tipping point with AI being very quickly embedded into so much of our daily workflows. And I think now we're going to see the pendulum perhaps swing back the other way a little bit with a refocus on where is human judgment best protected and retained and elevated, and really to kind of bring AI into better balance with humanity and just the notion of showing up as, with a kind of a radical human ethos and mindset and set of expertise every day, using AI to enhance and maybe amplify or accelerate rather than replace.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited to see how a tool like Scenario Lab and any of our, kind of predictives tools really start to unlock more curiosity for healthcare marketers, give them permission to go, to kind of step into worlds or what ifs that could happen, not at the sake of doing so frivolously, but really just thinking through all of the ways in which things like culture and politics and, dynamics that shape us and the way that we think every day and make decisions can really start to impact healthcare and those decisions that are happening, so that we can kind of truly move towards more creative solutions, but smarter solutions as well. And I think just that permission to be more curious is something that these tools really can help us unlock.
Well, I think you both offered a very thorough explanation of how marketers can really design these scenario-based planning changes that they need to in order to really be relevant in the future. So, Carolyn and Carrie, thank you so much for joining and offering your insight.
Thank you.